So welcome to this lecture on texture. And as you can see, there's some excellent texture back here. So what is texture? So it can either be the physical touch of a surface, or it can be the visual inference of a surface. Elements of texture will add dimension to your work of art, give it that three-dimensional feel. It'll also give it that tactile feel. And in our area, in our field, we also work with texture in a sense of the materials that go into the building. So when any surface has highlights, midtones, reflections, and shadows, it creates a three-dimensional surface that is either texture for real or appears to be texture. So we can have the illusion of texture. So panels on this building give the illusion of a rough texture based on how they are oriented. And as a result, it creates highlights, midtones, reflections, and shadows. So this is, I guess, one of those where it looks like it has texture, and it does have texture if you treat it as a big picture, right? If you ran your hand, if you had a giant hand and you could run your hand over the building, it would have texture. But we don't, and each of those panels is actually is flat and smooth on its own. So this sort of is one of those kind of trick question things, right? Because it is both visual and actual if the hand touching it is big enough. Otherwise, it's visual. So sometimes we work with texture to get an emotional response. Also, it adds dimension. In building design, we will use it to create interest and comfort and create an environment where people enjoy being. So look at these paintings are both done by Vincent van Gogh, and they both have texture, but it's very different. So texture, it has as much of a range as color or line or any other element. So the word texture came from the surface of woven fabrics. When you touch it, it was woven. But texture, again, can be actual or visual. And more about that, right? Actual texture versus visual texture. And in this case, again, this is both, because if you ran your hand over this, it's actual texture. But also those bricks sticking out create this very interesting visual texture as well. So if you can touch the work and feel the texture, then it's actual texture. It can have an visual element to it since it's three-dimensional. But in this case, that stone wall, that's actual texture. Some more examples of actual texture. And now some examples of visual texture. Right? The patterns in the tile and on the wallpaper give the appearance, they have a simulation of texture. But if you ran your hand over them, they'd be completely smooth. So that's how we differentiate. And just an example, right? So here's a painting that's very flat versus a work of art that is based on the first one that is actually three-dimensional, and the first one has visual texture, the other one has actual texture. Trompe l'oeil is something that you're going to see again in architectural history, because it was used quite a bit in a lot of the French works of art. And for instance, that painting over there is not a photograph, is a painting. And so the idea is that photorealism tricks the eye. And so there are a lot of really beautiful ceilings in residential buildings that the details in the painting were so realistic that they look like a photograph. These are not photographs either, they're paintings. Now there's this cool thing called invented texture. They make no reference to visible reality. The texture is the imagination of the artist. And this example is where the landscape is made from a skin-like texture in order to create a very surreal scene. It's weirdly beautiful and creepy at the same time. But we often do this in design. We often use invented textures to create something really interesting, because when you have a very large building, it's important to break it up to keep it from being this huge monolith that is so overpowering that it's uncomfortable visually. Subversive texture is something that compels the viewer to look at it again and think more deeply. So texture can simultaneously attract and repel us. Like I kind of was that way with the skin one. So texture can be used to create a pattern. It's upside down. Um, as a compositional device, or to create the illusion of space. And so we create pattern with repetition, which is actually a principle. And there's a relationship then that ends up happening between the texture and the pattern. And we will get to talking about pattern in more detail. The pattern may often be secondary to the imagery, as well as the texture. So it's more of a supporting element than the main element. And I will tell you that you have to be careful with texture and pattern in a space where it's like this, very detailed. If you make it, if you're going to say you decided, your client came to you with this and said, I want this in my living room, you would create a single wall or space or carpet that is that and nothing else. And, it goes back to how we talked about things that are very overwhelming like this. You can use them, but they should be your dominant element. Everything else should support them, and they should be limited and restricted in usage. So texture can be used compositionally. It can lead a viewer's eye through a space, through a room. In this case, through this piece, this three-dimensional work of art. Gradation also is something that is a texture that we can use to communicate the illusion of depth. As an object gets further away, the texture becomes less distinct, and that is what's known as a texture gradient. So the examples, the mountains in the foreground have detail, and the mountains in the background don't. And that is something to consider as you design, if you want to give or play around with the illusions of depth. So here's another example of the building, right? Texture, both actual, the brick is texture, and then the applied with the windows. It looks like it's got this rough texture to it. Texture can create a visceral reaction or an emotional response to the viewer. And sometimes you don't know. And that's why we always run things past our clients before we do them, because we want to make sure that the reaction that we're getting from them is positive. Now, again, visual texture, right? Because these are all flat planes. And these are the kind of things you can do with texture. In fact, let's go back to this a second. It's color and texture. I just wanted to point this out because, I could see someone looking at this going, hey, wait a minute, Ms. V, this is a pattern and color. Yes, but it's also texture. It's a visual texture. And so here's another example of, look at the outside of that house there, right? So there's texture and there's that bump, right? And look at the windows. So it's very intriguing and rustic and interesting, and the floor plan is over here. And then if you stand at any one of these areas, that's the elevation. It's really cool. But yeah, all the texture on that wall and how that big node sticks right out in the middle. It's always interesting to see how people solve design problems. And, I personally would have broken this up more with some columns or something, or false columns. or panels or something to break up the monotony of this. But it's very interesting. It's very creative. So the entire lower level in this house was cast using bamboo. And so it's concrete, but they used material, they used the bamboo to put striations in the facade that make it not feel like concrete. And so, because concrete can feel very hard and cold, and so they mixed in this house. They mixed the texture with nature, or they mixed concrete with nature to create a natural texture that doesn't make it feel as cold and sterile as concrete can when it's just a cast surface. Okay, and we're going to end this one here. This one's short and sweet.